idea for this presentation, for the paper that you have there, came from an invitation I had about 2 years ago, and it was from Connecticut 350.org, and they wanted to bring together the Connecticut 350.org people and a venerable old peace center located in New Haven called Promoting Enduring Peace. And they wanted to basically, they asked me to address what are the connections between climate change and peace, or actually they framed it as militarism and war. So when I got there, the audience is, a large audience is out here. To my left, it's all young, and to my right, it's people of our generation. They were the peace activists. The climate activists were in their 30s. And so I wrote an introduction, which is in the paper there, but I'll just read this so that I actually said this to the audience, but to discuss this difference in generations and what it signified. So looking out to my audience of young climate change activists and older peace activists gathered for a talk on war and warming, I saw in the generational difference what a lot of peace activists perceive. And Greenfield and Greening Greenfield is an exception to this. That peace, war, militarism, and nuclear weapons are an agenda of another era, an earlier era, while progressive political energy today is galvanized by climate change. It's exactly what the audience looked like. So when I said this, noting the discrepancy in age, the peace activists, the climate change, one climate change activist, he was like 30-something, raised his hand and then stood up and said that, he said, well, in my lifetime, no nuclear weapons have been used, whereas I have perceived in my lifetime that the climate has changed. And he was right. However, I wish that I had thought to say, in your lifetime, the United States has been involved in probably a good 100 to 110 conflicts. And that's our posture in the world, is military. Oh, here we are. Okay.
We found it.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, great.
So I will just synopsize for them very quickly. But Greenfield, or the Western Mass, is such an exception. We're both peace activists and we're climate activists, all of us white-haired folk. So, we do not reflect what I think is probably a good mirror that I was looking out to activism. I was saying that this talk came out of an invitation from 350.org Connecticut for me to speak on war and warming, I ultimately called it, but they invited 350.org Connecticut, and they invited probably the most active for 50 or so years, and it was during the era of nuclear threats and sort of Cold War, the height of Cold War between the US and the USSR. But it's a peace organization called Promoting Enduring Peace. They wanted to bring them together so that they would see how they could work together. What are the links between the two issues? And so I mentioned that as I looked out to the audience, on the left is Connecticut.org. I would say the average age was 35. On the right was Promoting Enduring Peace, and the average age was probably 75. And so I realized and said to them that, peace was an issue in the 1950s, 60s, a major issue because of nuclear weapons, the threat of nuclear war. It was a very hot Cold War at the time, and of course Vietnam War. And so a young climate activist raised his hand and said, well, in my lifetime, no nuclear weapons have ever been used. So it wasn't a movement, a reality, a threat that he perceived, whereas the climate has changed. And I just made a note that, in fact, we've been involved in wars all over the world, conflicts, etc. The time he was born, before he was born, the time he was born, and ever since as well. Someone has said about 150 conflicts. Not that we initiate all of them, but that even Syria, that our role in Syria is just an example. So with that, I'm going to use some PowerPoint slides to draw out the links between oil, and oil being a substitute for using fossil fuels, but the links between fossil fuels essentially and militarism and war. So this is a picture of the US Navy in the Persian Gulf. But first of all, oil-producing countries are more likely to have civil wars than non-oil. So there's a link between fossil fuels and conflict. A quarter to a half wars since 1973 have been over oil, certainly the Iraq War that we were involved in, and there's a case to be made for Afghanistan as well, as one of the factors there. The 1980 Carter Doctrine, good President Carter, best post-president ever. However, his heritage with respect to fossil fuels and militarism is the Carter Doctrine. And the Carter Doctrine says that U.S. will use military force to defend our access to oil in the Persian Gulf. And this is a typical picture when I look for these on the internet of the U.S. in the Persian Gulf. These are naval ships, and we have spent thus far, well, this was up to about 2-3 years ago, $8 trillion since the late 70s protecting oil cargoes. Do you know how far? Imagine how far that money would have gone towards resolving climate change. So the conclusion many have made is that oil is indispensable for war, and oil, as we know, fossil fuels are the root of climate change. So this is essentially why this presentation. What people are less familiar with is this link between oil, fossil fuels, coal as well, liquid natural gas, and also militarism. So 1/3 of crude oil from the Persian Gulf and Africa, and that's what this green is signifying, and 1/2 of the liquid natural gas, as well as coal supplies from Australia and a few of these other countries, Malaysia, they are transported through this South China Sea, and the South China Sea is the larger part of this blue that you see. And they're transported to all the booming economies of Southeast Asia. So it's China, it's Korea, South Korea, Japan, etc. Now, at the same time that this is happening, President Obama declared a pivot to Asia on the part of the U.S., if you remember that, as a kind of foreign policy move that he initiated. And so what was that about? Well, China has been perceived as a threat to us, both economically and more recent militarily. And so his pivot to Asia, which in rhetoric sounded not bad. It's about sort of refocusing our foreign policy concerns on countries that we have an alliance with. And so it would be Australia. That started up an alliance with Vietnam, the Philippines, of course, and few of the other countries, but those would be the dominant ones. And what did that consist of? It consisted of military exercises, reviving, renewing them, agreements with them about modern weapons, trying to get a military base or a shared one in Vietnam. We, of course, since the war, they've never tolerated that. The Philippines put us out in around 1990, 1992, no more U.S. military bases. We got back into them too. So essentially, it was really a militarized pivot under the rhetoric of reaffirming the importance of these countries and our role in the Pacific. But in fact, it had a feedback loop to it, which is that China perceived our presence, renewed presence, as a threat, and they were already moving this way because there are contested islands. You can see the Paracel Islands. They're contested by Vietnam, other parts by Philippines, and China wants those. And so there are oil and gas, possibly deposits, minerals deposits under it, and so they began to claim it. And as we moved in with our pivot, then they began to militarize these claims, building military bases on the Paracel Islands, etc., and on the Spratly Islands as well. And so what was an economic threat to us, competitor, moving into sort of our space, became also a military threat. And today, by some fluke, I get a subscription daily to the DoD News. And it's like a newsletter online. And so I scan it very quickly, and the Department of Defense cannot say enough. It's always the first news item that we are preparing for war with both China and Russia. It will happen within the next 15 years, very likely. That we need a larger defense budget, so they are calling for 3 to 5% increase in the defense budget next year and for years after. That we must continue the $1 trillion investment in rebuilding our nuclear weapons and capacity. And so this is the headset, the mindset, and the sort of foreign policy, you might say, on the part of the government, but the headset of the Pentagon. And so they said terrorism is no longer, in their emails, no longer the threat that it used to be, that the threat is big power war with China, and we must be ready to at least win one or be able to wage two and be successful. So we don't be surprised if next year, under Trump, while he's there, there's going to be an effort to get a higher and higher Pentagon budget. And I will come back to this later, but essentially, this year's budget, the highest ever, altogether almost $1 trillion, was opposed by only 5 Democrats, and the rest voted for it. And this is what I want to get to, is what are our strategies in terms of our own Democratic politicians with respect to the defense budget and budgets that are coming up. So we also have militarized oil struggles at home. So Standing Rock protest was met, as you can see, by militarized police. And essentially they used many weapons which were extremely, injured many, and they based rubber bullets, mace, attack dogs, water cannons in freezing temperatures, tear gas, and something called concussion grenades. And a medic, I believe he was a veteran who had gone there to treat the wounded, said it felt like a low-grade war. So essentially, declaring war on our own peoples when there is protests against fracked oil, going under their source of drinking water, the Missouri River, etc. I will just add something that's actually quite tragic, which is that the leader of the Standing Rock protest, and he was head of his tribe there, he lost his leadership after the protest was over. It ended because President Trump reversed a decision by Obama to have an environmental study done of the impacts. He reversed it, and so it basically was finished, and it has fracked oil in it. Now, there's been a judge who's holding that oil from traveling to Illinois. However, the leader of the protest lost his position. I guess they elect the leaders in his tribe because the tribe has a casino on the tribal lands, I guess not too far from this protest, and the casino lost something like $10 million in profits. It usually profits about $14 million a year, and they have 40% people living below the poverty line. And so you see you grasp the complexity of the situation. The next slide, what I want you to do is, I want you to look at the colors of the wheel while I walk through what is allocated to what agency in the government. Let me first explain the discretionary spending. That represents the part of our annual budget after the required spending happens, and that is Medicare, Social Security, possibly some of Medicaid. Those are the major expenditures in our budget. What's left is called the discretionary spending budget, and this is how it is allocated. Defense today, that's 2017, gets even more than that. They get close to 60% of the discretionary spending. So as you look at the colors around the other half of the wheel, I'll read you what they are. So defense, of course, is purple. You have education, transportation, veterans benefits and services in the lime green. income security, I'm not sure what that is, health, international affairs, administration of justice, natural resources and environment. So that would be this one. General science, space and technology, community and regional development, general government, Medicare administrative, agriculture is yellow, slim yellow, so, and social security administrative costs, and then energy is the slimmest one there. Now, where would climate change, the budget for climate change be located? It could be split among natural resources and environment, general science, space, and technology for research. But energy is probably where most of it is. And you see the paucity of funds dedicated. And if I find my notes here, I can't right now, but defense gets 700 billion in that 2017. You might add to that the veterans' benefits and services, because especially those who have been in the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, those benefits come from the injuries of those wars. So some people actually put that together with defense and national security also, and you end up actually with something like 60 to 70% of our discretionary spending funds go to some form of militarized defense of the country. And the true security issues of our country, which are, of course, education, transportation, agriculture, energy, natural resources, and environment, get altogether something like 8% of the budget. So I believe it was $40 billion allocated for research on climate change versus $700 billion, near to $1 trillion on defense. And yet, they are the two critical issues of the day. Nuclear weapons and a nuclear war, and also climate change. And if you recall the bulletin of the atomic scientists, who have measured how close are we to midnight being self-destruction by nuclear weapons, that was post-World War II, they have added climate change to it as well, seeing climate change as an equal threat to the annihilation of the planet. And together, those two issues have moved closer to midnight. It's 2 minutes, I believe, from midnight. It's the closest point that their clock ever was since the 1950s, when we were at the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the threat of, and as you recall, I mean, that threat lasted through Kennedy's early administration, the threat of nuclear annihilation. So this slide shows the calculations that some groups have done in terms of how much did the war in Iraq add to climate change. So first of all, the estimated $3 trillion cost of the war is an amount that would have met all needed global investments in renewable energy by 2030 to reverse global warming trends. That $3 trillion actually has been moved up to about $6 to $7 trillion by the most accurate organization at Brown University that calculates this. In the 4 years of the war, 2003 to 2007, more greenhouse gas emissions annually from the war, and that's our use of oil in that war, and jet fuel, than 139 countries. Someone has calculated that U.S. military is the largest consumer of oil in the world, so it's the largest institutional consumer, at 5% of the oil used in the world. However, that does not include the defense industry. The defense industry making all the weapons that we both use and that we sell to the entire world has more Superfund sites in this country than any other industry by far. Superfund sites, and they're sort of leaks of solvents, for example, firefighting foam, and Superfund sites consume a large amount of oil in the cleanup, or let's just say fossil fuels in the cleanup of those sites. Now, I figured that if we are a little more than a third of our military expenditures is 37% of the entire world's expenditures, then I've added the entire world's expenditures to come up with 15% of oil used in the world over for military purposes is a truer estimate. And there are a few things that even qualify that. One is the degraded environmental sites that have to be cleaned up as Superfund sites. So that would raise it above 15%. And another is that jet fuel used, we are the largest, our military is the largest user of jet fuel, actually pollutes up to 3 times more carbon dioxide than oil and gas. So the 15% would be raised, creeping up maybe to 18% of fossil fuels used in the world over militarism. And this is another consideration that people don't think about with respect to war and fossil fuels. This is a photo of the town of Raqqa, the city, Raqqa, Syria, very recently. We bombed the town in Syria because ISIS was in that city, and we were at the same time bombing Mosul in Iraq because ISIS had a crescent in both countries that they were controlling. And so to catch men hiding in buildings, we bomb. And the head of the US in the Middle East, it's called CENTCOM, basically looked out at a scene like this about 3 or 4 months ago. He said, it's a pile of rubble, concrete, toxic rubble. He was calling for the world to rebuild it. I don't know why they think they would if we destroyed it. Now, greenhouse gas emissions from manufacturing concrete are equivalent to 5% of global emissions. It is I think it's the most, not oil intensive, it's the most polluting and generating of carbon dioxide for a couple of reasons, not just its use of fossil fuels. And so the Middle East is full of buildings that need to be rebuilt by concrete. Water and concrete are the 2 most used resources in the world. So essentially, this is another debt we could add on from militarism to creating climate change. And then, of course, looking ahead to climate crises and conflicts, Middle East, Africa, where just temperatures and also drought are driving immigrants, as they did in Syria, from the countryside to the cities. So migration from drought, desertification, sea level rise, happening in vulnerable areas of the world, and possibly then climate crises leading into conflict, as they did in Syria. And in Syria, it's known that the long drought drove farmers to cities for survival. They were not well taken care of. There was no social safety net for them, and so they joined the Arab Spring in Syria and the popular uprising in 2011. This is a conceivable scenario in other countries of the Middle East. So these are all the links, as you see, I'm trying to pull together in terms of militarization and climate change. Now, don't bother with Trump right now, but we'll go through that. So there's a historian whose article I read. This was Victor Hansen, and this is the profile. He did it proudly, the profile of the United States. What sets us apart as special, exceptional? He said, well, we just had a sense of manifest destiny. We have to get, first of all, genocide of the Native Americans, get to the West Coast, conquer everything, steal lands from Mexico, and then beyond that, head out to Cuba, Puerto Rico, to Hawaii, to the Philippines, etc. Another quality related to that, the frontier mentality, and which has been lionized, as you know, in films and television series and books and movies that we saw growing up as kids. Rugged individualism, everybody knows that as a characteristic of Americans. I mean, it's supposedly a proud aspect of our history. And rugged capitalism, unfettered market capitalism, still touted, by economists in this country, Chicago School and others. And then something he called a muscular independence. And that particularly reminds me of Trump as he talks about nationalism. and sort of making us great again. It's recovering all of these characteristics which many historians have used to describe our country and to laud our country and to set it apart as exceptional. So this I couldn't resist putting in. I found it on the internet. When Trump talks about how he would smash ISIS, kick 12 million people out of the country, bring China to its knees, doesn't it sound like all of these characteristics of American identity? But just once I'd like a reporter to ask, how did your career as a reality show host prepare you to do these things? So what I have done in the next slide is to present the alternate American identity. And essentially, in her own way, the speaker, Susan Hammond, actually presented this alternative identity. And I mean, I didn't have enough room for all of the movements that I could have put here. But you know, you recognize all of them, and many of you have been involved in a number of them. And I want you to look at those carefully. And also, can you add to those? I mean, things that I didn't have room for. What would you add to those? All of these multifaceted but intersectional movements that have really created an alternative identity for many of us in our country. What have I missed here? I know I have without...
LGBTQ.
Okay, LGBTQ, yes. How else is it termed? Sexual preference, sexual choice, movement, something like that. Yeah. Anything else? Maybe I got them all. I don't know.
Oh, the anti-gun and violence.
Yes, anti-gun and violence. Let's see.
Immigrants.
What?
Immigrants.
Immigrants, that's right. Oh yeah, I'm going to try to squeeze that in. Yeah, what kind of a phrase would you coin for that? Immigrant rights,
Well,
immigrant
as our
rights
speaker
movement.
this morning said, welcoming immigrants.
Welcoming immigrants, yeah. Any others that you can think of?
Equality.
Traprock cover what the work that you
Well,
do
the
with
native, yeah,
native.
getting in touch with our the native heritage of the land of
Yes.
other peoples, and I guess that would be understanding our, yeah.
I kind of, with Standing Rock Water Protectors, but that's just like the most recognizable way of saying indigenous rights, indigenous movements, communities, yeah. Did you say something, Nancy? Did I hear you?
Well, have we, is poverty covered?
Yeah.
Well, there, I'm not quite sure what I say, but.
No, but you know, the Poor People's Campaign
Oh, there
would
you
be
go.
also, I mean, yeah, would cover that.
Here we have hunger and
Yeah.
things we do in this area to try
Right.
to help with that. The other thing would
Maybe
be
food security?
housing,
Food
and
security,
homelessness.
yes. And even with housing, I think we lack the right to housing. I mean, it's not one of the rights that we acknowledge as in our Constitution, to my knowledge, and the society as a whole, especially the society of those other qualities. But right to housing, affordable housing is another issue in terms of which the country, many cities, the popular cities, are really in crisis over. Yeah.
Well,
Healthcare is a right.
Healthcare as a right, housing as a right. We have education as a right. We have free speech as a right. We have religion as a right. But healthcare, and see, socialist capitalist countries, progressive countries in Europe, or I don't know if I call them progressive, but you know, they recognize those as rights.
I guess, prison rights, the criminal justice.
Yes. Yeah, what's the movement for that? Is there a term for it, as we have for many other movements?
All this restorative justice, I don't know.
Restorative justice,
Ending mass incarceration.
ending mass incarceration, yeah. But you see, I mean, you get a sense of the plenitude of progressive, humanistic movements in our country that you could, as who wrote the People's History? Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn's People's History covers much of it through the time that at the time that he wrote it. Yeah, it is the alternate and should be the primary history and profile of the country. Okay, so I finish with two golden rules, and the first we're familiar with. All major religions and humanism have basically stood by this first: love thy neighbor as thyself. I think we need the second, and this really comes out of what we learn from indigenous. Just love thy nature as thyself. I mean, they call it mother, our mother. And that both of these should be the guiding principles of how to end war and also how to restore our place in nature. I will say I chose for that second photo a photo I found of it's the regreening and a community garden movement of Detroit. And Detroit is full of houses that look like this, only they don't own this yet, but they have done it in such a way that they're restoring nature and also bringing beauty back through the restoration, or what they have done with that building. And so what I would like to do here now is basically have us all discuss, how do you address this marriage in which divorce seems impossible between the military, its use of fossil fuels, and climate change, so that as we work in either of those movements, we can begin to figure out, how do you bring them together? How do you bring the messages together, the strategies together, the actions together? Because I feel that the Democratic Party has always been pretty good, I should say, and you can talk to them about these issues here, issues that do create an alternate American identity. However, they have been as supportive of military and the military budgets, almost. Few exceptions. The African American woman from Oakland being one of them, who voted against the Iraq War when hardly anyone did. But the Democratic Party really does not have a foreign policy that's very different from the Republican Party. And I have read that the new progressives coming in have basically, I mean, I know this, you know from their speeches, have focused on the issues of rights to housing, rights to food security, of course, Medicare for all, and controlling the price of housing in cities. But they're not tutored in. They've been asked questions and not really tutored in. Our involvement throughout the world, 800 military bases, 150 conflicts since 1970 or so, and it's because we never hear about it, we're not educated in it. We really don't see our country as a military superpower, and where most of our budget reflects that. And also the devotion, I mean, the military is the most respected institution in the country. Polls have shown that. Pew Charitable Trust and others have taken polls and found that. And also, there's very little news about the things we do wrong in the world as a military. So consequently, it's very challenging to figure out, how do you speak about this? It's not so challenging how to link it to climate change, because, you know, everything that I've researched, it's there. that they're a huge part of the problem. They're the biggest institutional part of climate change in the world. So I'd like to just open it up for strategizing about what messages would work, how to bring one issue into the issue of your activism, bring them together in the issue of your activism. How do we deal with the politicians? What's the entry point for starting to bring this conversation up, for educating them, actually, because nothing does in our news and analysis. I will give you a few ideas that I have, but I'd like to. I really feel it's an extremely big challenge to figure out how to do this. My first way of doing it was to just make a sign. It might have been a climate change protest, but a sign that brought the two issues together, an equation of some sort, or war and fossil fuels at one of the gatherings here. And I'd always use it now, for a women's march or anything. And I think the other was to give talks like this, and also to write, like the article that you have, to put it out there. But I even met with our speaker who's coming up, our representative, about Vietnam before I was going there to look at third-generation Agent Orange victims and what we owe Vietnam, and that there is a bill in Congress which has about 17 sponsors, and it goes nowhere year after year, and it's called the Agent Orange Act, something like that. It's renewed every year, and it basically says, it asks for money for health services for Vietnam, third, fourth generation, all the generation victims of Agent Orange, the same for Vietnamese Americans here. And it also extends benefits to Vietnam veterans who have been exposed to Agent Orange here. But I brought it up to him, and it really didn't resonate. It just didn't seem. It didn't seem to click as an issue of justice that we owe. We're doing better with Vietnam, giving them some more money now, but that's because we want them as an ally in this kind of this battle for friends that's going on in Southeast Asia with China and then these other countries. So I'd like to then hear some of your ideas. Yes.
Well, when you started talking about this, I remembered the film The Gatekeepers about Israel, where I think 5 or 6 generals in the Israeli army, when they retired, came out and said, this is wrong. Clearly against Israeli policy toward the Gazans in the West Bank. So, and then there's been other instances, I believe, of American people, generals, retiring and then speaking. So I don't know how do you make that more public, let the current military know that this has happened and you can do it now. You don't have to wait till you retire.
Until you retire, all wait till they retire.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know what to do with that information.
And it is, you're right, it makes such an impact when it's a general level person, and if there's a group of them, all the more on current policy, not sort of regretting past policy, but on current policy. Yeah.
I don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, how do we do that?
Because Israel is more military than ever.
Oh, it's hyper-militarized, yeah. And they are our greatest beneficiary of aid, as you know. It's something like $2 billion a year. And then what they do is they buy, of course they manufacture their own, but they buy weapons from the United States. So, much of that money we give in aid to Saudi Arabia, and we kept theirs about $200 million lower than Israel, just to assure both that the balance of power there, we're not trying to, mess that up. That was under Obama. Obama's foreign policy wasn't really a shift in any major way. Yeah. Yes, Louise.
A couple of days ago, I went to the senior symposium. I don't know if anyone else had.
Oh, at GCC?
At GCC. Well, it was at the senior center, the new senior center that John's on. And it was a Professor Lendler from Smith. He's a political science teacher. And he was talking about after the election, what it all meant, this recent election. But I asked him, he was talking about the balance of power between the parties and such. And I asked him why, and he said that money in politics is important, but it's not all that important. So I said, if money's not all that important, where does the NRA get their power, since over 75% of Americans, regardless of party, claim that they want some kind of gun control? And he said, and light bulbs went off. He said that politicians, when people say they want some kind of gun control or military limits or whatever it is, if it's kind of a vague comfort thing. I want some kind of gun control. It's not specifically that everybody wants whatever, registrations, or everybody wants smaller magazines or what have you. It's just this kind of vague kind of thing. And politicians have this sixth sense that if they work towards this vague thing, they're going to lose votes. And that their primary survival instinct is to work for votes, regardless of what else. So if we can't form this into something tangible that everybody wants and that forces our legislators to vote for it, according to him, it's not going to happen.
It's not an effective campaign or persuasion tactic or technique for them. Well, I mean, there is a progressive caucus, and there have been 5 or 6 who did not support the defense bill budget as it was submitted by Trump. Within Congress, there are congressionals who have a sense of how much to reduce the defense budget and then move it over to the other side, all those other sides. I do think that there is a set of them that have figured out how much it could be reduced without there being rebellion, and that they talk about it among themselves. I'm not quite sure how it then gets out of that caucus all in agreement to try to influence other. I'm just hoping that this new group going in, they are going to be, they're going to be part of the progressive caucus, but that they could be open to being tutored on this stuff, this discretionary budget, and recognizing what's wrong with it, and then as a group figure out what they would counter propose for defense budget, and then for the other. Then they'd fight over the other part of that, given there's like 15 different issues there. Yeah. It's just I'm sure that I'm sure that our representative in Congress must be part of that.
Jim McGarvey?
Yeah.
Yes, I would imagine. He's been billions.
Yeah, but in terms of the budget, I would imagine he's one of the 5 or 6 that did not support the defense budget. Yeah. Yes.
Having said that, I'm glad that it's all women in this room, because
You're glad it's all women.
women in this room, because
Did you
I can
get that on
say
tape?
this without
Reactions?
the least bit of apology. When you spoke about the American identity, patriarchal, that's what it is. It's, we don't have to tell anyone
It's
here.
in your face. Yeah.
Right, and I was thinking about when there were all these comments on the armistice, and they were saying, well, the culture was different then. They were militaristic. The societies were so militaristic in Europe, and as if it weren't militaristic here. It's just a different form of it, and it's also a different form of patriarchal control. So the women, the 200, how many women? 101 women in Congress. They are, they may have different politics, but I think that's a tiny step. If we can start there, then just changing the culture very, very slowly. And again,
the proportion of women is what you're saying is that change increase the proportion of women.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I
Effective.
would, if
That it's- it
maybe,
can be effective.
we would take over, huh? Right. But, yeah, so that's one thing. And another thing that's just not in the same
Mhm.
basket is when you said the 3 times polluting jet fuel,
Mhm.
three times polluting. One of my bugaboos is how everyone, many of my climate activist friends will just hop on a plane whenever they feel like it. And there's just very little consciousness about that, about how flying is
I
like
agree.
huge contributor to
Yeah.
climate change. And it's like, that's one habit that people really, really need to get off of.
That's a hard one, I think, for people
Because
to hear.
people love it, they love travel, they want to see this person and that person, and it's a good thing to see the world. It's considered, it's good for your development to see,
Yeah.
to go travel and see other
Yeah,
people.
and not
But we
parochial.
need to change that. We just
Yeah.
need to change that.
Well, what would be effective ways to get that message out? That let's just say regionally. I mean locally. Why don't you write a My Turn column for and just put the facts down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not that kind of a person to write, but if somebody wants to collaborate with me on it or whatever,
Okay.
Yeah, it's just.
And
And hard
you
to-
can Google. You can find the stuff on the internet.
Well, it's hard. It's actually, you know what? I did Google that.
Okay.
It's very, very hard. I Googled something whether people choosing not to fly or something like
Yeah.
that. And, I've heard one speaker who's a climate scientist speak on that subject, but
Mhm.
almost never.
It's
No,
interesting.
no.
I want to address your first point
Yeah,
also. That at the Paris conference, this was 2 years ago, and the Conference of the Parties for the Climate Change, British scientists, I read their stuff once in a while, and then they were interviewed a lot, so that if you're following the news on that, on something like Climate News Network, which I subscribe to, they said they did not fly over because of the contribution to global climate change of flight, and they took a boat over. I mean, of course, it's easy from Britain to do that, and you have a fast speed train under the British the Channel, so it was possible. But it also was a lesson. They're privileged enough to I need to get there as quick as possible because I'm who I am. But no, they were very aware of. Yeah, okay, I'm going to throw it out. I think My Turn would be a nice way to just start educating locally. Your first point, which was that it's hopeful to see a larger percentage of women. First of all, I have always been moved that Democrat and Republican women in Congress meet once a month. And intentionally, I don't know how much political talk there is, but it is obviously building bridges, and that bridge is there when they need it. But the other thing is, I recently read a book called Sex and World Peace, and it was co-written by maybe a team of researchers, international studies, statisticians, they're US-based, at many different schools, and they created a database that they called Woman Stats, and they looked at about 300 different variables, sort of ways in which you could measure the inequality or the equality of women in a society. And just simple ones would be literacy, income inequality for the same job, violence against women, so domestic violence, prostitution, trafficking. This data is possible to get from some countries and through the UN. And it went on, percent of women in government, and at different levels. And so they compiled that database, and then they took the World Peace Index, which a group, I think it's in Sweden, a group of researchers there keep, looking at every country, measuring degree of conflict within the country and country to country. And probably looking at weapon sales, not just conflict, but all manifestations of that, and probably looking at number of people in jail per population, in prison per population, a lot of those ways in which violence happens. And then they compared So what happens is usually these things are done on a scale of 1 to 5. Where does a country rank? And let's say 5 being the best, 1 being the worst, or vice versa. They did that also with these 300 variables that they had developed for every possible issue, even something called boy preference. And that could be measured by the number of girls who are infanticide, who are aborted in any country. Even they found a small percent here like that. Consequently, though we should be a higher percent of the global population and the country population, if you have son preference, boys get to eat more, they might get more medical care, but also this abortifacients and ways to get rid of a girl fetus. So so you can see the extent of, then they created an index from 1 to 5 in terms of a country's equality, women's equality versus men's equality. And then they compared that number to this global peace index using statistics so that they could, you could say, oh, they're 4 and 5 or 3 and 2, but they took all of those for all countries, and then they used a particular type of statistic analysis to come up with, is there a relationship between the inequality of women and a country's degree of conflict? And they also use the word security because that's the field they study, security studies, the field that many of them have studied. And they found, and then they did it with degree of democracy within a country, because there's a democracy index like the peace index. And this is just an aside, that democracy index, for a number of countries, their degree of democracy is declining. It's very recent trend with the fascism in different Western European countries, our own country as well. I think I've read that about 1/3 of the countries in the world have a lower rating on the democracy index than they did 5 years ago. But that said, so they looked at how much of a correlation is there statistical between the status of women in a country and a country's degree of conflict. They also did that with degree of democracy, rating in democracy and rating in peace index, and they did it with kind of ethnic conflict. It could be religious conflict also within a country, and its degree of its peace. Where does it rank on the peace index? And they found that the strongest indicator of degree of security and lack of conflict and peace was the status of women. It was stronger statistically. It's not to say those others aren't important. Of course, democracy is. And the conclusion that they made from that was that probably one of I could say primary, but at least one of the primary things a country could do, a world could do, but a country could do, is work on the equality of women in order to lessen. In our case, it would probably result in a lower military budget, DOD budget, especially if they're in there voting on it, but also if it's widespread known and women are creating forums and speaking and working on women's equality, but that if they get into high office, that is one way to lower that defense budget and increase the other ones that we have talked about, the right for housing, for health care, for food security, etc. So your point is good. And it's actually been verified, you might say, statistically. And then when I spoke about this at a conference, I attended one in Africa. It was the African Women's Feminist Peace Conference in August through Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILF, that age-old organization that Jane Addams and other European women found at the time of the First World War. They tried to talk to all the patriarchs involved in that war to stop the war. Well, WILF has a strong African branch to it in many countries which have known tremendous conflict. So it was held in Sierra Leone. That's the country where there was blood diamonds, wars, horrific wars. And they're at peace now. And essentially, I interviewed African women about this finding, this correlation. What did they think? There was no question for them. None at all. They even use the word patriarchy. But they said that what they need is women in government, women's equality, girls' education, etc., and this will change their countries. They saw that connection complete. Much harder to see here, I would say. I think it's not. It's in the background, but certainly not in the foreground of consciousness. Yes.
And I think if that shift can happen, there has to be a shift in the short-sightedness that we have about, that things can go on forever, as opposed to looking at the long term and what are we leaving for future generations, and the fact that people in power they don't seem to give a shit about what's going to happen to their own grandkids or their descendants. There's no thought about that at all. But women bring children into the world, and if they're not in constant conflict and fighting for their lives everywhere, I think there would be a big shift in caring for nature and the world, and
it would transfer.
It would transfer
over to all these other sectors.
And while we don't have that, if we don't get some of that money out of the military into dealing with climate change, I mean, we're stuck with trying to do things on our own, and even if we don't fly or don't do a lot of things, it's not, with everything that's happening right now, it's not going to make that much difference.
With a no to low budget, for addressing climate change.
It's got to be a huge shift, but it's not a lot of time.
Yeah. So I think it's very promising to see the number of women, and especially Democrat women, progressive young women, in there. Yes.
I was just in D.C. and I went to Jim McGovern's office, and I had made out 12 questions concerning the military, from the 800 bases to the I knew he voted no. All of our senators and rep voted no on the military budget. But I was covering all kinds of areas that we need to be looking at, like, are you going to vote yes to block military aid to Saudi Arabia right now, and so forth. And I didn't get to talk to him, but I talked to Cindy. And the interesting thing that came out of that, because we talked about the 800 bases around the world, and is Jim on board with decreasing? And what she said, and so this gave me a real eye-opener to the fact that we need to do a lot more progressive education about what's happening in the world. She said, well, we really can't decrease any bases in Europe because look what's happening to Ukraine. Well, what are we doing to Ukraine? And what are we doing to Russia? Look at the way we have moved military weapons all along the border of Russia. And so for us to have this attitude that we have to have these bases there because otherwise Russia's going to take over the world is crazy. And that's where I feel like we need to start, as they have offices up here, our reps, and to go in, I think it really, and try to have these difficult conversations for people to open a little bit to the fact that maybe Russia isn't as bad as we think. It's not really totally our enemy. Would be one way to start changing, because, and also we live in a state that has one of the not number one, but one of them, military weapons producers, Raytheon. We have Smith & Wesson that produces the AR-15, is it? That has killed in so many of our mass murders. We could start taking those things on to try to move forward. And I'll just share one last quick thing. I was introduced to a gentleman, Maliki, who is working with John Lewis, and will be introducing, it's been introduced in a number of years, a bill in the spring for what's called a freedom. They actually call it a religious freedom, but it's not really totally geared for the religious, although they're some of our most conscientious objectors. But it's a freedom tax fund And if they could get this passed, that would mean your average American who's afraid of holding their taxes back that they
go
would
to
like
the
to do.
military, that go to the military.
Yeah, that goes to the military. That it could go into there, and then they say, oh, 35% of my taxes go there, and whatever that fund decides to spend it on would be non-military. And you could designate out that the rest of your taxes would be also non-military. And that would mean that the military would be decreasing in the amount of money they get. That means that either they're going to have to raise taxes, which you know the Dems and Republicans don't want to do, and it would also mean that maybe less money would be available for contracts with Raytheon and Markey.
And that money, you choose where that money goes to these other departmental issues that assure human rights and other things, research on climate change. It could be designated to go to those.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And if any of you are in Richard Neal's district, he is now going to be the chair of the Ways and Means, which designates where money goes. So, talk to our reps when they're up here. We can find out when they're in their local offices. And so I'm putting that as a way for us to.
It's very practical. I think, and I don't think it's the first time this idea has been introduced, but perhaps if someone here was interested in going with Emily to talk with him, I mean, when he's here, or to his staff when they're here about this, you could follow up on that.
Yeah, Jim has been on board. Jim McGovern's on board with this.
Yeah.
It has come up. They've been introducing it probably for the last 20 or 25 years, and every single time it's been.
But with also the new set of reps in Congress, they need to be educated on these issues too. But I would think they'd be on board. Pat, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I've got a million things,
Oh,
but
please,
one,
yes.
I wanted to ask you the name of the organization that did that study about women's status.
Okay, I found Women's Stats, it's called, just on the internet. First I read the book, and then I looked up to see is it easily accessible, Women's Stats, on the internet, and it is. And I hope there was a popular article written by one of the authors and key researchers of this that I found on foreign policy, something or other. I hope that's on the site because it's a quick read and yet it gets it all in. Yeah, but the book, the author, first author of the book is the woman who wrote this popular article in Foreign Affairs, I think it was. The book is called Sex and World Peace. And of course I thought of John Lennon first, Make Love Not War. I'm thinking, what kind of a book is this going to be? It is incredibly researched and well done. If you look up the book and see the first author, she's the one who had an article in Foreign Affairs, I think it was.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got some ideas out here about a My Turn column about meeting with Jim McGovern and or his staff. But with him, when he's in the region, would be best.
This afternoon.
What?
This afternoon. He's speaking here.
He is speaking.
Yeah, right.
I was actually thinking, if you're moved to ask a question of him from this session, such as our defense budget is over $700 billion, what do you think it should be? Just a simple question.
That's a
like
good
that.
question.
Yeah. And I'm happy to ask it, but I'd be happier if one of you wanted to, because it sort of gets it going.
But I guess my thought when you said that is that's a good question, but I'd like to hear him speak about this Freedom Tax Fund because that's a very specific.
It is.
He is going to support. It's a very concrete
Okay.
point.
So which of you wants to make sure he gets asked that? Emily's, she's
Well,
really,
I'll try.
She's up on it.
Another question was, when did you start getting these DOD emails or notices about,
Yeah. It was about 5 months ago.
so since Trump, which
Yes,
is what I
maybe
was
6
getting.
months ago, yeah.
Okay.
And it really gives you this inside view of the way the Pentagon is thinking about the world, and it's all in terms of competition and enemy. It's a terrible paradigm that you step into and a mindset. It's really, I can't read it too much. I mean, I look at the headlines. I used to read the articles. Then I wondered why I didn't feel so good. But it's an incredibly militaristic, pugnacious, us versus them, a schoolyard bully type of worldview. And it is so total. I don't see them able to step outside of it and see Russia a different way. Like, maybe Russia's reacting to the fact that we've pushed NATO up to their doorstep when we promised not to under Bush. I think it was George H. Bush.
One thing.
So, did you want to subscribe to it? I'm sure they'd welcome.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay. I'll tell you what. Take that, write me on that email address on the other, Justitia, Traprock,
Okay.
and just ask. I'll send you.
Another thing was I read an article recently, and I can't remember where it was from because I get killed on my phone every day with emails and messages and then on Facebook. But it was about the fact that when Vietnam was happening, it was on the news all the
Yes.
time.
Oh, yeah.
We saw the people,
Yes.
body bags, we saw, you know, all this stuff, and it was in our face.
I
And
saw
now
the children
we're,
on fire from jelly gasoline. Yeah.
yeah, whereas now almost nothing is coming across on the news to let us know about.
That's right.
I'd heard, what, about 18 active conflicts we're in right now, but
Yeah.
you said 100 and something
Well,
that we've
no,
been
since,
in.
yes, since.
But
I
we
know.
don't hear about
Because it
it,
was
so
draft.
people don't
That's what it
know.
was. Because there was a draft.
It
That
was a
a lot of
draft
it.
and now there isn't,
Yeah.
Yeah.
no draft.
And
And
it's,
also, a lot of journalism is embedded. You know, they made that in the Iraq War, and so they sort of determined what was covered. It is. I mean, it's a huge loss in our news reporting. Is our presence in the world 800 bases? Who knows that? Unless you're concerned about it.
so how can we get that to be reported on is the thing I was thinking of
You know,
as we were
I just
talking
read an
about.
article about the closing of newspapers, big and little, not just local newspapers, but big ones too. And if they're not closed, they are about a quarter to a half the size that they once were. And so they cut back on reporters, and that's part of it. The real investigation going on. But I think the second is, it's incredible. Well, it's corporate owned. A few big corporations. They're not going to send their reporters to cover this kind of news. It's and the military is the most respected, according to surveys, by citizens in the United States. Where do you start when that's the case? And it's because we don't really cover. It's not covered what they do.
And part of the reason is the corporate profits, because the same corporations that are owning the newspapers own the military.
Yeah. Some
Build
part of
up
that
and
whole
whatever. Yeah.
industrial complex. They're
Exactly.
involved in that.
I thought I heard that the military has not, or is having more difficulty reaching their,
Recruiting.
recruiting.
Yeah.
I'll just give you.
That could be a route to go.
This is what I learned from the DoD site. I'll tell you why. Let's see, 29%. See, I was a math major. I don't know. Numbers stay in my head. I wish other names don't, and names of places and people don't. 29% of kids 17 to 24 is all that they see as eligible. Obesity, illnesses, asthma, and other things as well. Drugs, that's right, drugs, and also kids in jail. And so after they look at all that, and also intelligence enough, to serve in the military, so they are having trouble recruiting. But your point is good. And also they said that what are they called, Gen Z, that
Generation.
they're not as interested in joining the military, and also the economy, quote, 3% unemployment, but there are jobs. So your point is good, though, that it is another sort of good place, point of entry, is when youth are together, talking about, or that there should be youth outreach to youth, like comparable to the military recruiters.
They come into, I don't know if they still do, but
They do.
come into Mohawk High School.
Oh, Mohawk,
And
I
at
don't
one
know.
point, well, when I was more involved, we wanted to have an anti-table
Mhm.
And I don't know what happened with that, but that's another thing to think about.
Yeah.
Really important.
It has to be, it has to give them as much sort of pathway, and
Right.
that's job skills and jobs, as that's what the military offers. So I will be proud of you if I hear some questions to our representative, Jim McGovern, and I'll be happy to get you the site. And if I ever see a My Turn column, co-author.
I didn't come here to get this way.
I know you didn't, and I don't mean to put pressure, but now you know she's interested in it, and someone else who would be interested in partnering with her to write it. Yeah, that, it could work, no pressure, it could work that way, but, yeah, so we've got some strategic ideas, yes.
This is a little bit aside, but if you have time at all, go into the art gallery in the south, there's an art gallery, you can ask how to get there. There's a remarkable show going up by the faculty in the art department, the head of the department, and several others, and the other artists are getting them up. It's on guns and children, basically, but I think it's relevant because it is
Yes.
violence.
Yes, it is.
It's everywhere, and it's by the faculty here,
Yeah.
and it's started to be
A
put
culture
up.
of
It's
guns here
remarkable.
becomes a culture of guns across the world.
Yeah.
We sell more than anybody else does. We are more present with guns throughout the world, and it starts here. And it started with genocide, I truly believe, with the Native Americans and with slavery. We used weapons for our manifest destiny, and until we, did I say a root canal? Until we extract those toxic roots, I think we were shaped by that, and that's why we are where we are, the top military superpower in the world.
And it still is in the culture, because I just heard
Yeah.
on a woman representing the NRA, and one of the awful comments that went into my mind is that, yes, we women need them, they're an equalizer. Talk
Imagine
about,
equality.
and it's very hard to change minds.
Having guns is an equality, tragedy, yeah.
And I think that
Thank you for all of your ideas.